Justin Leonard is not the loudest name in golf history, but what he has achieved is enough to place him among the most respected golfers of his generation. A major champion at the Open Championship in 1997, when he was just 25 years old, where he delivered an outstanding final round to come from behind and win the Claret Jug, a title that took him from a young talent to a new symbol of American golf. Not stopping there, he also secured a total of 12 victories on the PGA Tour, including the Players' Championship in 1998, the tournament regarded as the fifth major of golf. He was a key member of the United States team at the Ryder Cup, appearing multiple times and leaving an indelible mark on the history of the event. Before turning professional, Leonard won the U.S. Amateur Championship back-to-back in 1992 and 1993, affirming his status as one of the greatest amateur golfers in America. He also received the Haskins Award for the Outstanding College Golfer while competing at the University of Texas. All those accomplishments paint the picture of a steady, intelligent, and extremely resilient golfer. A man who does not need flashiness to prove his worth. But behind those titles is a story rarely told. Because golf is unlike any other sport, it does not allow you to hide from yourself. And Justin Leonard has had to live under the pressure of his own successes, especially after the major win in 1997, when the whole world began expecting him to become a dominating legend. Yet golf does not work according to expectations. And when Tiger Woods arrived and changed the entire landscape of the sport, Leonard and an entire generation were pushed into the shadows. He still competed, still fought through every round of golf, but victories became rarer, and every failure felt heavier. Then came the moment at the Ryder Cup in 1999, the 45-foot putt that wrote him into history, but also brought controversy he could never control. From then on, he had to face not only opponents on the course, but also memories he could not erase. The years that followed were a quiet battle with himself, with pressure, with time, and with the evolution of modern golf. But he never disappeared. He continued to play, continued to exist, continued to stand firm in a sport that forgives no one, and that more than any trophies is the clearest proof of Justin Leonard's will. Before moving to the next part, please hit like and subscribe to the channel to follow together the journey of a man who has stood strong amid the pressure that golf brings. Because behind that historic putt is a longer story, where glory does not erase the silent battles that Justin Leonard has carried throughout his life. After the 45-foot putt at the Ryder Cup in 1999, the whole world saw Justin Leonard as a man standing on the boundary between glory and controversy. But very few people stopped to wonder what journey had brought him to that moment. Because the answer does not lie in the cheers at Brookline, but in the long silence from his early years in Dallas, Texas, where he grew up in a stable family that lacked nothing but also had nothing special to draw attention. No spotlight, no expectations that one day he would become part of golf history. There was only a quiet boy living in a city where football was almost a religion, where other kids dreamed of packed stadiums, of touchdowns and roaring applause, while Justin Leonard chose a different path, a path that from the beginning carried solitude. He did not choose team sports where failure could be shared and victory multiplied by teammates. He chose golf, a sport that does not allow you to hide, where every mistake is exposed and every pressure falls on one single person. And from very early on, Leonard stepped into that world as if it were the only place he truly belonged. Those long afternoons in Texas, passed on the practice range with no cheers, no coach standing right beside every swing, only the repeating sound of club striking ball, of ball landing on grass, and of thoughts constantly swirling in the head of a boy still too young to fully understand what he was facing. Golf taught him patience, but it also taught him that no reward comes immediately. Golf taught him focus, but it also taught him that a single second of lost control is enough to destroy everything. And most importantly, golf taught him how to be alone, not temporary loneliness, but a lasting state where you must talk to yourself, confront questions no one else can answer for you. Could that last shot have been better? Am I good enough? Do I deserve what I am pursuing? Those questions did not disappear when you left the course. They followed you home, followed you into sleep, and woke up with you the next morning. And gradually, they became part of who you are. Justin Leonard was not a loud or showy child. He did not need attention, because his world lay in the narrow space between the tee box and the green, where everything is measured in inches and decided by near absolute control. But that very control created an invisible pressure because you can never fully control a game like golf, and Leonard began to realize that from a very young age, every time the ball strayed from its intended path, every time a putt did not drop, he had no one to blame, no one to share it, with only himself and the feeling that he could have done better. That feeling was not loud, not intense, but it was persistent. It accumulated over time, and it became an inseparable part of the journey. Many people look at golf and see elegance, see lush green courses and smooth movements. But for Justin Leonard, golf was a silent war, where the greatest enemy was not the opponent across the fairway, but the thoughts inside his own head. And as he grew up, as his talent began to be recognized, as the first victories came and opened the door to a professional career that did not reduce the solitude but instead made everything heavier, because every step forward came with more expectations, more pressure. Yet the foundations of who he was had been formed very early, in those long afternoons without applause, in the hours when no one was watching. And perhaps that is why, when the whole world rose to cheer at Brookline in 1999, Justin Leonard was no stranger to pressure. He had lived with it for nearly his entire life. The only difference was that this time, the silence he had grown used to had vanished. In its place were tens of thousands of eyes watching, and what had once been an internal battle had now become a stage he could not step down from, whether he wanted to or not. And then, when the cheers at Brookline gradually faded, when the stage lights no longer shone directly on Justin Leonard's face, what remained was not the moment of victory but the very game that had shaped him: golf. A game that never compromises, never forgives, and never allows anyone to reach the perfection they crave. Because golf, more than any other sport, demands something almost impossible: absolute precision. Every swing must be repeated with near mechanical accuracy. Every putt must be calculated to the inch. Every small movement of the wrist can change the outcome. And in that world, there is no room for error. Or at least, that is what Justin Leonard believed from when he was very young. He did not just play golf. He tried to control it, tried to make it perfect. But golf is not something that can be completely controlled. And that very truth became the source of silent but persistent pressures. Because in golf, sometimes just one tiny mistake, a shot off by a few inches, a putt with insufficient force, a split-second loss of focus, is enough to destroy an entire round you had built over many hours. And Justin Leonard had experienced that countless times: rounds that were nearly perfect, until one single shot dragged everything down. Days when everything seemed under control, until golf reminded him that nothing is truly certain. At each time, the pressure grew, not from the spectators, not from the media, but from himself, from the desire to do better, to be more precise, to be more consistent. And to achieve that, Leonard built a routine that many outsiders never saw: long hours of practice, repeating the same shot hundreds of times, standing alone on the range when the sun had not yet risen, and long after it had set, not because he was forced, but because he believed it was the only way to survive in this sport. But the more he practiced, the more he realized a painful paradox. You can prepare for everything, but you can never completely eliminate mistakes. And that created a special kind of pressure, a kind of pressure that no one imposed on him except himself, a never-satisfied internal standard, an inner voice that always whispered that the last shot was still not good enough, that you could do better, that you must do better. And over time, that voice stopped being motivation and became a burden. because it never fell silent. Even when he won, even when he lifted the trophy at the Open Championship in 1997, that voice was still there, reminding him that one victory did not mean he had achieved perfection. And perhaps from that, another fear began to form. Not the ordinary fear of losing, but the fear of failing to meet the standard he had set for himself. The fear that just one moment of lost control could make everything collapse. And in golf, that fear is not imaginary. It is the reality that any golfer must face. But for Justin Leonard, it became deeper because of the way he viewed the game. He did not just want to play well, he wanted to control it, to master it, to remove the chaos from a sport built on uncertainty. And that very effort made him learn to control his emotions to an almost absolute degree, not showing disappointment when he missed a shot, not letting excitement affect the next swing, keeping everything inside, keeping everything in a stable state. But the price of that control was a constant tension, a mental fatigue that was not always visible from the outside. And when looking back, perhaps the hardest thing was not hitting a perfect golf shot, but living with the idea that you must be perfect in a game that never allows it to happen. And Justin Leonard carried that idea throughout his journey, from his early days in Dallas to the biggest stages in the world, where every shot was not just a sporting action, but a test of endurance, of patience, and of how a person confronts the very expectations they can never fully reach. And then, in the years when Justin Leonard was still trying to control every swing, every breath, and every thought of his own, his life unexpectedly entered a stage he had never truly prepared for, a stage where success came faster than the ability to adapt of a person accustomed to living in silence. When he entered the University of Texas, it was not just a milestone in his academic path, but also a door opening to the world of elite golf, where talent was no longer something exceptionally rare, but the minimum requirement for survival. Yet right in that fiercely competitive environment, Justin Leonard began to stand out in a very different way. Not through flashy shots or an explosive style, but through something that made many people wary: his almost cold stability. He was not the player who made spectators stand up and applaud for a spectacular shot, but the one who gradually broke the spirit of his opponents when they realized he almost never made mistakes. Each of his rounds was like a tightly controlled process where everything was executed with a precision so high it was frightening. And that very style led him to victories that not everyone could achieve. Back-to-back wins of the U.S. Amateur Championship in 1992 and 1993, an achievement that not only affirmed his talent, but also placed him in a position from which everything began to change. From that moment, Justin Leonard was no longer an unknown young golfer. He became a name that the golf world began to mention with expectation. The press started following him. Articles began to appear, and along with them came titles he had never thought of before: the future of American golf, the new generation's successor, the next hope of a sport that always craved symbols. But those very titles carried an invisible pressure that no one could clearly see from the outside, because Justin Leonard had never been someone who sought attention. He did not grow up wanting to become a star. He simply tried to play golf as well as he could. But when the world began to see him as a symbol, everything was no longer simple. Each shot was no longer just part of a match, but became a confirmation or a disappointment for the expectations placed on his shoulders. And the hardest thing was not performing well, but having to live with those expectations every single day. Leonard still kept his style quiet, reserved, not seeking the spotlight, but that very silence made him a special image in the public eye. A golfer who was not loud but extremely reliable. A person who did not need to say much to prove his worth. Yet inside, the battle continued, because each new success did not reduce the pressure but only made it grow. When you win once, people call it talent. But when you win back-to-back, people begin to call it the standard. And from then on, anything less than victory could be seen as failure. Justin Leonard entered that stage of life when he was still very young, when he was still trying to understand himself. Yet, He had to carry on his shoulders a role that many people only achieve after an entire career representing the future of American golf. A role that sounded glorious but in reality was a relentless burden, because it did not allow you bad days, did not allow you mistakes without judgment, and more importantly, did not allow you to be an ordinary person who was learning and growing. Leonard continued to compete, continued to win, continued to prove he deserved what people said about him. But each step forward came with a familiar feeling, the feeling that he always had to do more, to be better, to be more consistent. And that very feeling, which had been formed from the early days on the golf course in Dallas, was now amplified by the eyes of an entire sport, turning his journey into a run with no finish line, where the destination always moved farther away every time he got closer to it. And perhaps, among all the things success brought, what Justin Leonard never truly had was relief. Because even when he stood at the peak of amateur golf with two U.S. Portweight amateur titles in hand, he did not see it as an ending, but only as the starting point of a longer, harder, and lonelier journey, a journey where perfection was no longer a goal but a requirement he felt he could never fully meet. And then, after the years when the name Justin Leonard gradually became known as a hope for American golf, the door to the professional world finally opened. But what awaited him behind that door was not a continuation of victories, but a completely different reality. A reality where even the most talented could be crushed if they were not strong enough to survive. When Leonard officially entered the PGA Tour, he quickly realized that everything he had known before was only the tip of the iceberg. Because here there was no room for inexperience, no room for repeated mistakes, and no patience for those who were not ready. Every week was a tournament. Every tournament a brutal selection where only a few stayed until the weekend, while most were eliminated after the first two rounds, leaving the course in silence with no fame and no prize money. And Leonard, despite coming from success at the amateur level, was not exempt from that rule. The early rounds were no longer as easy as before. The shots that once brought victories now faced opponents with equal or superior skills, people who had lived in this environment longer and understood better how to survive under pressure. And what made everything even harsher was the never-stopping pace of the PGA Tour. 1 week in California, the next in Florida, then flying to another state, long flights, unfamiliar hotels, mornings waking up not knowing where you were. And amid all that, you still had to step onto the course and play as if it were the most important day of your career. Leonard not only had to compete, he also had to learn how to live in a rhythm where body and mind were constantly stretched, where fatigue was never allowed to become an excuse for a bad shot. Because in professional golf, no one cares how you feel, they only care about the result. And behind those numbers was a financial pressure that few outsiders understood. Each shot affected not only your position on the leaderboard, but also your income and your ability to continue competing. Because if you were not good enough, you did not just lose one tournament. You could lose the chance to play in the next one, lose your spot on the tour, lose everything you had built. And that turned every round of golf into a real battle for survival. Leonard faced days when things did not go as hoped, rounds where he was eliminated early, leaving the course in disappointment with no applause to soothe it, moments when he had to wonder whether he truly belonged here. And that was a question most young golfers had to face, but not everyone could answer with perseverance. Leonard had no choice but to continue, to keep practicing, to keep adjusting, to keep learning how to adapt to an environment where perfection was no longer a distant goal, but the minimum requirement for survival. He began to understand that talent was only the starting point, that what kept you there was not what you had already done, but the ability to do it again and again, under pressure, under fatigue, under the eyes of opponents, always ready to replace you if you faltered. And in that process, Leonard gradually changed, not in a way that was easy to notice, but in how he faced failure, in how he stood up after bad rounds, in how he accepted that this path would never be easy. He did not become louder or seek attention. Instead, he became even quieter, even more focused, as if all his energy was poured into surviving in a world that never allowed you to stop. And it was in those challenging years that Justin Leonard not only learned how to play golf at the highest level, but also learned how to live with uncertainty, with pressure, with the feeling that at any moment, if you were not good enough, this game would continue without you. And perhaps that was the hardest lesson the PGA Tour taught, a lesson Leonard never forgot even when he began to find his place. Because deep inside, he understood that everything could disappear as quickly as it came. And that awareness made each of his steps heavier, but also more resilient, like a person trying to hold on in a storm that no one could control. And then, after all the unstable rounds, the endless flights, and the days when Justin Leonard had to wonder whether he was good enough to survive in the harsh world of the PGA Tour, 1997 arrived like a turning point that no one, not even he himself, could have predicted. At Royal Troon, Scotland, in the Open Championship, where the cold winds and harsh links course had tested so many legends, Justin Leonard entered the final round, not as the expected winner, but as a name lagging behind. A person still having to prove he could stand firm on golf's biggest stage. But then, shot by shot, hole by hole, he began to move forward. Not loudly, not explosively, only with precision and calmness that was astonishing. His 65 that day was not just an outstanding performance, but a statement that he belonged there. That he was not just a young talent, but someone who could win at the highest level. And when the final putt dropped into the hole, when the claret jug was placed in his hands, Justin Leonard, at 25 years old, became a major champion, a title that many golfers chase their entire lives without ever reaching. The whole of America looked to him as a new symbol, a face representing the next generation of golf. The media called him the future, the hope, the one who could continue what the previous legends had built. And in that moment, everything seemed perfect. Every effort, every sacrifice, every pressure was rewarded with a victory no one could deny. But right in that seemingly complete moment, something else also began to form, something no one saw immediately. Not joy, not relief, but an invisible burden called expectation. Because from that second onward, Justin Leonard was no longer allowed to be an ordinary golfer. He became a standard that he himself had to continue meeting. Every tournament after that was no longer an opportunity to compete, but a test of whether he deserved the title of major champion. Every shot was no longer simply part of the game, but a confirmation or denial of what he had achieved at Royal Troon. And that pressure did not come from a single source. It came from the media, from fans, from sponsors, and most importantly from himself, because Leonard was not someone who easily accepted satisfaction. He had been used to setting high standards for himself since he was a boy in Dallas, but now that standard was no longer fully under his control. It was amplified by an entire world watching, and that began to change how he saw himself. Instead of stepping into each tournament with pure focus on every shot, he began carrying a heavier question. Could he do it again? Was that victory the beginning of a great career, or just a moment that could not be repeated? And in golf, where confidence and doubt are separated by only one shot, that question could become a burden not easy to escape. Leonard continued to compete and kept his stable style, but inside everything was no longer the same. The victory at the Open did not bring the peace he might have expected. It brought a new kind of tension, a kind of pressure that every passing day reminded him the peak was not a place to stop, but a place where you must constantly prove you deserve to be there. And what made everything harder was the reality that golf is not a sport that allows you to win continuously as you wish. There are days you play well and still lose, days you feel perfect and still are not enough to win. And for someone who had just reached the peak like Justin Leonard, that uncertainty became harder to accept than ever, because now he was not only competing against opponents, but also against the memory of his own victory. a memory that everyone around him always repeated, always compared, always expected to be repeated. And gradually, what had once been pride began to become a shadow he could not escape, because it followed him in every round, every swing, every moment, standing before an important putt. And perhaps that was the most painful paradox of success, that sometimes the greatest moment in your life is also the moment that takes away the peace you once had. And Justin Leonard, at 25, learned that in a way no one had truly prepared him for. When he stood at the peak of world golf but began to feel that the road ahead was no longer a free journey, but an endless run to keep up with the very peak he had reached too soon. And then, when the trophy at the Open Championship had become part of history, Justin Leonard realized that victory did not end his journey, but only opened a harsher stage, where each round was no longer an opportunity to prove himself, but became a continuous measure of whether he still deserved the title of major champion. From that moment onward, there were no more normal rounds of golf. Every time he stepped up to the tee box, every swing, every putt, lay under the gaze of the media, of the fans, of the experts, ready to analyze every smallest detail. And what made everything heavier was not the attention itself, but the way that attention turned into expectation. Because to the outside world, a major victory was not a peak, but a promise of many more victories to come. They did not look at the reality that golf is a sport full of fluctuations, where even the best cannot control the outcome. They only looked at the title and expected it to be repeated. And Leonard, who had once been used to setting standards for himself, now had to face standards set from all sides. Every time he did not win, the question immediately appeared: what happened? Had he lost his form? Was the victory in 1997 just a fleeting moment? And those questions, even if not always spoken directly, still existed in the atmosphere of every tournament, in the way people looked at him, in the way he was mentioned on the leaderboards. And gradually, Leonard began to feel clearly that he was not just competing. He was being judged, not only through the final result, but through every shot, every decision on the course, every reaction after a mistake. And in a sport where confidence plays a decisive role, always feeling like you are being watched could become a pressure that was not easy to relieve, because you could not turn off those eyes. You could not step onto the course and forget that everything you did could be dissected. And that began to change the way Leonard approached the game. Not in technique, but in psychology. He no longer focused only on executing the best possible shot, but also had to face the fear that a small mistake could be magnified into a major failure, that a round that did not go as planned could become proof that he was no longer at his peak. And that fear, though not loud, carried great weight, because it did not disappear after one round. It accumulated over time and became part of every tournament, every season. Leonard continued to compete with the professionalism and stability that had made his name. But inside, the battle had changed. He was no longer facing only the golf course, but also his own image. The image of a champion that he felt he had to protect, to maintain, to prove was not a fluke. And that pressure, unlike what he had experienced before, did not come from a specific moment, but from the continuous stretch of expectation, a form of pressure with no clear starting point and no ending point either. It followed him from one tournament to the next, from one year to the next, and gradually it created a fatigue that not everyone could recognize from the outside. Because Leonard was not someone who showed emotions clearly, he still maintained his calm appearance, still walked with the familiar composure, but inside the tension kept building. Each round became a test not only of skill, but of endurance, of whether he could continue to stand firm under the weight of the very title he had won. And perhaps the hardest thing was not maintaining form, but accepting that there was no way to return to the state before the victory, no way to go back to being a golfer who was not expected from, not compared, not placed under a microscope. Because from the moment he lifted the trophy at Royal Troon, everything had changed forever. And Justin Leonard, whether he wanted to or not, had to learn how to live in a new reality, where success did not bring freedom but carried a form of constraint he could never completely remove, a form of invisible pressure with no specific shape but always present, always reminding him that in golf, sometimes the greatest victory is not winning a title but finding a way to survive after having won it. And then, while Justin Leonard was still trying to stand firm under the weight of the major champion title, while he was still learning how to live with the gazes that never left him, an earthquake began to spread through the world of golf. Not a small change, but a comprehensive shift. A new era opened by a name that would later redefine every standard of the sport, Tiger Woods. The arrival of Tiger was not just the arrival of a talented golfer, but the arrival of a force that changed the way people viewed golf, the way people played golf, and most importantly, the way people judged golfers. Before that, stability, precision, and control like Justin Leonard's were enough to bring a golfer to the peak. But when Tiger stepped in, all of that no longer seemed sufficient, because Tiger did not just win, he dominated. He broke records. He turned golf courses once considered challenges into places he could control in a way few had ever done. And suddenly, the standard of greatness was pushed to a level almost no one else could reach. Longer shots, lower rounds, and almost absolute confidence. All of it created an image that the media and fans could not look away from. And in that brilliant light, many golfers, no matter how talented or hard-working, began to fade gradually. Not because they became worse, but because one person had changed the entire measuring stick. Justin Leonard continued to compete, still maintained the stable form he had built over many years, still had good rounds and respectable results, but the attention was no longer on him as before. The stories no longer revolved around him. The headlines no longer mentioned him as a center. And that did not happen suddenly, but gradually. Like a rising tide, he could not stop. Each tournament passed, each season ended, the name Justin Leonard was still there, still appeared on the leaderboards, but no longer in the position he had once been expected to hold, no longer the symbol of the future, but a part of a present that was gradually being replaced. And for a person who had once been seen as the hope of American golf, that change was not just a professional reality, but a psychological experience that was hard to accept. Because he did not feel he had declined significantly, he still practiced, still competed, still tried to maintain his own standard, but the world around him had changed. And in that new world, what had once been enough now became insufficient. What had once been praised now was seen as ordinary, and that created a feeling not everyone could describe, a feeling of being left behind. Not because you stopped moving, but because someone else was moving forward at a speed you could not match. Justin Leonard was not the only one who experienced that. An entire generation of golfers from his era also had to face a similar reality. Those who had once been considered the top now had to watch someone else dominate every stage, every title, every bit of attention. And in that context, continuing to compete was not just a technical matter, but a matter of will, because you had to find a reason to keep going when the world no longer looked at you the same way. Leonard did not withdraw. He did not disappear. He still stepped onto the course every week, still executed every shot with a familiar focus. But inside, a change was taking place. He began to understand that his career would not be defined by dominating an era, but by the way he existed in an era where he was not the center. And that required a different kind of strength, not the strength to beat every opponent, but the strength to accept that some things were beyond your control, that you could do everything right but still not be the one remembered the most. And in a sport where fame is often tied to victory, continuing to compete in relative silence could become a greater challenge than any round. Justin Leonard continued through those years with a steadfastness that few recognized. No big headlines, no continuous explosive moments, only a man still trying to hold himself steady in a world that had changed. And perhaps the most painful thing was not being surpassed, but having to witness that change day after day, tournament after tournament, season after season, with no way to turn back, only the ability to keep walking in an era where the light had shifted direction, and people like Justin Leonard had to learn how to exist in the shadows without losing themselves. And then, in an era when Justin Leonard gradually felt he was no longer the center of the golf world, in the years when the light was slowly shifting in another direction, there was a moment that returned like an unfading memory. A moment that should have been pure glory, but carried echoes longer than any victory. Brookline, 1999, at the Ryder Cup, where Justin Leonard stood before a putt that not only decided the outcome of a match, but also shaped the way the whole world would look at him for many years afterward. The distance was nearly 45 feet, a putt with very low odds of success. The green was not simple at all. Every break could send the ball offline in a split second, and in that moment there was no room for hesitation, no room for fear. Leonard bent down, read the line, stood up, and executed the shot with the calmness he had built throughout his entire life. The ball rolled away, slowly but surely, as if pulling with it the full attention of the course. And then, when it dropped into the hole, Brookline erupted. The American crowd exploded. His teammates could not hold back. They rushed onto the green, hugged Leonard, jumped in the joy they believed was a victory already in hand. It was a rare moment when golf, a sport usually tied to silence, became an emotional storm. But right in that explosion, an invisible line had been crossed. Because the match was not truly over yet, the European opponents still had their putt, and the American team celebrating right on the green was not just a spontaneous act, but was seen as a lack of respect, and almost immediately, the atmosphere changed from joy to tension. From excitement to cold stares, protests began to appear, not only from the European side, but also from people watching the match around the world. And Justin Leonard, who had just made one of the greatest putts in Ryder Cup history, suddenly was no longer just a hero. He became the center of a controversy he could not control. The media began to analyze not only his shot, but also what happened afterward. Images of the American team celebrating flooded television channels. Articles questioned sportsmanship, the boundary between emotion and respect. And Leonard, even though he had not started the chaos, was still pulled into the center of the story, because he was the one who made the putt. He was the face of that moment. And in the world of sports, where image can be stronger than reality, that was enough to tie his name to both glory and controversy. In the years that followed, every time the Ryder Cup of 1999 was mentioned, Leonard's putt was always remembered. But rarely was it spoken of purely as a feat. It always came with questions, opposing opinions, memories that were not entirely clean. And for Leonard, that created an indescribable feeling, because he knew he had done what every golfer dreams of, making a decisive putt in an iconic tournament. But he also knew that moment would never fully belong to him in a way he could be completely proud of. It was shared, debated, viewed from different angles he could not control. And over time, his image in the public eye became more complex, not just a champion, but a controversial figure, a person tied to one of the most debated moments in modern golf history. And perhaps what made it all heavier was not the criticism, but the reality that no matter how much he continued to compete or achieved other accomplishments, for many people, Justin Leonard would always be remembered first by that putt, by that moment, as if his entire career had been reduced to a few brief seconds at Brookline. And that, for a person who had spent his whole life pursuing stability, perseverance, and perfection, was a paradox not easy to accept, because he was more than that putt, but the world, in its own way, had chosen to turn him into exactly that moment-to-moment, both brilliant and imperfect, both proud and never completely at peace. And from then on, Justin Leonard carried not only the memory of the 45-foot putt, but also everything that came with it: glory, controversy, and a mark that time could never erase. After Brookline, after the putt that put Justin Leonard's name into history but also forced him to carry a mark that was never completely light, life did not stop to wait for him to adapt. The next season still began, the flights still took off, and the PGA Tour schedule continued as if no moment was big enough to slow down that wheel. But for Leonard, everything had changed in a way that was very hard to notice from the outside, because if before he had competed to move forward, to prove that he belonged here, now he competed in a different state, where every round carried the echoes of the past, of expectations of a major title and a Ryder Cup moment that he could not separate from himself. And it was in those years that another form of battle began. Not loud, without big headlines, but persistent and more wearing than anything he had ever experienced. Victories no longer came as frequently, not because he was no longer good enough, but because golf never allows you to stay at the peak forever. Each week passed with a new leaderboard. New names appeared, younger, stronger, ready to take the position you once held. And Leonard, even though he still competed with the familiar stability, began to realize that stability sometimes was no longer enough to make a difference. In an environment where the gap between victory and failure could be just one putt, not winning continuously could make you gradually fade from the center of attention. And that created a special kind of pressure, not an explosive pressure, but a silent one that accumulated with each season, each round, each day you stepped onto the course and tried to hold a standard that you yourself knew was becoming harder and harder to maintain. Leonard continued to practice, continued to compete, but his body no longer responded as before. The constant travel between tournaments began to leave its mark. Mornings waking up with fatigue he could not completely shake off, long rounds under harsh sun or cold wind, repeated practice hours that made his body gradually feel heavier, and along with that came mental fatigue, a kind that could not be measured but was always present, because each round consumed not only physical energy but also concentration, emotional control, and the ability to maintain belief in himself. And when those elements began to decline, even just a little, it could create differences that only those inside truly felt. Leonard was not someone who easily showed that fatigue. He still kept his calm appearance, still walked with the familiar certainty. But inside, the accumulation of pressure and fatigue was gradually creating small cracks, moments when he felt he had to try much harder to achieve things that once came naturally. And outside the golf course, personal life was not completely separate from what happened on the course. The constant trips made time for family limited, moments when he could not be there, days when he was in a strange city while life at home continued without him, and that, even if not spoken about much, still created a feeling of imbalance, a feeling that his life was divided into two parts. One part on the golf course, where he fought against opponents and himself, and one part off the course, where he tried to maintain the relationships and values he did not want to lose. But those two parts did not always harmonize, and as time went on, that separation became clearer. Leonard stepped onto the course each week with the same goal to play the best he could, but he also carried an increasingly clear awareness that this path was no longer the same as before, that each step forward demanded more effort, more sacrifice, and sometimes fewer rewards. And perhaps the hardest thing in this stage was not losing, but continuing to fight in a state where victory was no longer certain, where you had to find a reason to continue even when the results did not reflect your efforts. Justin Leonard never abandoned the game. He did not disappear, did not give up, but continued to walk forward, continued to compete, like a person who understood that golf is not only glorious moments, but also long years of perseverance, where you must face yourself in silence, without cheers, without recognition, only the question repeating in your mind, can I still continue? And each time like that he stepped onto the course again, as a way to answer, not with words, but with action, even knowing that answer would never become easier. And then, when the years of continuous competition began to leave clear marks on his body and mind, Justin Leonard gradually realized a truth that every athlete eventually has to face, but no one is truly ready to accept. The game you have spent your whole life pursuing will continue moving forward, whether you can keep up or not. A new generation began to appear, younger, stronger, faster, golfers with superior physical condition, longer shots, bolder playing styles. They did not just join the game, they changed the way the game was played. And in that world, what had once been Justin Leonard's advantages, stability, precision, control, gradually became no longer enough to create the clear difference as before. The gap was not always shown clearly on the scoreboard, but it existed in the way matches unfolded, in the way young golfers approached the golf course, in the way they attacked holes that people used to play safely. And Leonard, with his experience, saw that change every day, every tournament, not as something surprising but as a flow he could not stop. He still competed, still tried to maintain his form, but opportunities to compete in the big tournaments began to decrease gradually, not because he no longer had the ability but because the standard to win had changed. And that change did not wait for anyone to adapt. The major championships, the tournaments where he once stepped up with the belief that he could win, now became challenges where he had to try much harder just to stay in the game. And each time like that, a new awareness gradually formed. Not loud, not sudden but clear, that a sports career, no matter how great, also has limits. That the body cannot forever respond like when you were 25 years old. That the mind, no matter how determined, cannot avoid the signs of time. And Leonard began to feel that not through one single moment but through many small moments. Shots he knew he had executed correctly, but the results were no longer the same as before. Rounds where he played well but still was not enough to compete with those at the peak. Days when his body needed more time to recover. And all of that, when combined, created a feeling that no victory could cover up. The feeling that time was gradually taking away what you once considered natural. And the hardest thing was not realizing that but accepting it. Because for a person who had spent his whole life pursuing perfection, accepting that he could no longer reach that level was a process that was not easy. Leonard was not someone who gave up. He did not leave the game when things became difficult, but he began to change the way he looked at it. Not as a race to prove he could still win at the highest level, but as a journey to rediscover the meaning of competing, to understand that his value was not only in the titles, but also in the way he continued to walk forward when everything was no longer the same as before. And that process did not happen in one day. It stretched through many seasons, many tournaments, many moments when he had to face himself with questions no one else could answer for him. Can I still continue? Should I still continue? And in those moments there were no spectators, no media, only a man standing on the golf course, looking into the space ahead, and deciding to step forward, not because he did not recognize the change, but because he accepted it, little by little. Leonard did not become the person he once was, but he also did not disappear. He existed in a stage where many others might have left, not through domination but through perseverance, through continuing to compete in a world that had changed. And perhaps that was one of the greatest challenges he had ever faced. Not winning a tournament, but learning how to live with the reality that the game he loved would continue without him at the center, and still finding a reason to keep loving it, to keep stepping onto the course, even when he knew the light no longer shone directly on him as before. And then, when Justin Leonard gradually accepted that the golf world had changed, that the center position no longer belonged to him, he began to find something that before, in the years chasing perfection and victory, he had never really had time to fully understand a life outside the golf course, a life not measured by strokes or leaderboards, but by relationships and ordinary moments. And at the center of that life was Amanda Leonard, the woman who had entered his life not as part of the spotlight or fame, but as a quiet anchor, a person who did not see him as a major champion or a name on the PGA Tour, but as a human being with all the fatigue, pressure, and gaps he carried from many years of competing. Their marriage was not a loud story of newspaper headlines, but a steady bond, where Leonard gradually learned how to become a husband, not in moments of victory, but in ordinary days when there were no spectators, no applause, only conversations, meals, silences that he had rarely had the chance to experience before. And then when their children were born, his role changed once again. From a person who always had to face the pressure of performance, he became a father. A person who had to be present not on the golf course, but in the lives of the children who were growing up. And in that role, he found a different kind of meaning. a kind of value that did not depend on whether he played well or badly, won or lost, but simply on the fact that he was there, that he listened, that he shared the small moments he had often missed before because of the non-stop travel. Life in Texas, where he and his family built their home, became a space separate from the pressure of the media and the golf world. There, he was not Justin Leonard of the Ryder Cup, not the one who had once lifted the claret jug at the Open Championship, but just a man living with his family, taking the kids to school, spending time with his wife, and trying to find the balance he had lost over many years. And it was in those moments that he began to understand that the failures on the golf course, the seasons that did not go as hoped, the pressures he had once carried, were not the entire story. Because when he returned home, no one asked him about his score. No one judged him by the competition results. He did not need to prove anything. And that, for a person who had lived too long in a world where everything was measured, was a release he did not easily recognize right away. But over time, it became an important part of how he existed. Family did not erase the pressures, did not change what had happened on the golf course, but it gave him a place to stand firm when everything else became uncertain, a place he could return to after every tournament, every trip, every failure, and find a sense of stability that golf could never provide. The quiet evenings, the laughter of the children, the conversations unrelated to sports, all of that gradually became a source of energy that helped him continue to walk forward, not to return to the peak, but to continue living, to continue competing, to continue being himself in a world that had changed. And perhaps the most important thing Justin Leonard found in this stage was not a new victory, but a new way of looking at life, an understanding that his value was not only in what he had done on the golf course, but also in what he was building off it. And that very shift, from a person who only knew achievements to a person who found meaning in ordinary things, helped him stand firm in the years when, without that anchor, he might not have been able to continue. Because in a sport where everything can change with just one shot, having a place that does not change, a place that does not depend on results, may have been exactly what saved him from losing himself. And then, when family life gradually became a solid anchor, when the returns to Texas no longer carried the feeling of emptiness as before, but became a place that helped Justin Leonard maintain balance, a new chapter in his life began to open in a way that even he had never predicted. Not with a perfect swing or a big victory, but by gradually moving away from the role of a competitor to step into a different position: the observer, an analyst, a storyteller of the very sport that had shaped his entire life. When Leonard began to appear as a golf commentator and analyst, it was not an immediate replacement for his playing career, but a slow transition process, where he still kept a connection to the golf course but was no longer bound by the pressure to win. And that change, although it might look gentle from the outside, carried a very profound meaning. Because for a person who had spent his whole life measuring his value by competition results, stepping out of that role was not just a job change, but a change in the way he viewed himself. Leonard no longer stood on the tee box with thousands of eyes following him, no longer had to calculate every shot with the pressure of the leaderboard. Instead, he stood on the sidelines, looking at the game from an angle he had never had the chance to experience before. He no longer had to react in a split second, no longer had to make decisions in a few seconds, but could observe, reflect, and share what he saw, what he understood. And in that process, he began to see golf in a different way, not just as a series of shots, but as a complex story of psychology, strategy, and emotion. He realized things that before, when he was still competing, he could only feel but could not express. The moments when a golfer stood before an important putt, the small changes in the way they held the club, in their breathing, in their eyes, all of it became clearer when he was no longer the one at the center of that pressure, and that allowed him to reconnect with the sport in a new way, no longer as a battle for survival, but as a relationship built on understanding and respect. Leonard did not leave golf. He only changed his position in it, And this change did not come without its own difficulties, because accepting that he was no longer competing at the highest level required an adaptation that was not easy. There were moments when the memories of the days on the course were still very vivid. The feelings when standing before a decisive shot, the pressures he had once carried, all of that did not disappear. But they gradually became part of the past that he could look back on with greater calm instead of having to live in it. And in the new role, he began to find a different kind of meaning. Not victory, but contribution. He could help viewers understand the game better, could share experiences that not everyone had, and could keep a connection to golf without having to pay the price he had once paid throughout his years of competing. And perhaps the most surprising thing of all was realizing that he could still love golf in a different way, a way not dominated by results, not limited by expectations, but simply an appreciation for a sport that had given him everything: glory, pressure, memorable moments, and even the difficult years. Justin Leonard entered this stage not as someone who had left the game, but as someone who had found another way to stay. A way that was not loud, not showy, but enough for him to continue being a part of the world he had spent his entire life understanding. And in that transition, he did not lose himself but gradually rediscovered a version of himself that had perhaps been hidden during the years chasing perfection. A person who no longer needed to prove anything to the world, but only needed to live true to what he had learned from everything he had been through. And then, when Justin Leonard gradually found peace in a new role, when he no longer had to step onto the course with the pressure to win, the remaining question was not how many titles he had achieved, but what he had left behind. Because in the world of sports, where names are often measured by the number of victories and dominance, Leonard was not the one who stood at the peak the longest, but his journey carried a different value, a value not easy to see immediately. Starting from the victory at the Open Championship in 1997, the major title had placed him in a very small group of golfers who could say they had reached the peak of the sport. Along with that were 12 victories on the PGA Tour, titles that did not come in a short, explosive period, but were accumulated over many years, through rounds where stability and control had become his own signature. Leonard was not the player who made spectators stand up for spectacular shots, but he was the one opponents always had to watch out for, because they knew he rarely made big mistakes. And in a sport where mistakes could decide everything, that was an advantage that could not be underestimated. But if there was one moment the world would never forget when mentioning Justin Leonard, it was still the 45-foot putt at the Ryder Cup in 1999. A moment that, even though it carried controversy, became a symbol of a tournament where emotion went beyond the usual framework of golf. Leonard was not just the one who made that putt. He became part of collective memory, an image that every time the Ryder Cup was mentioned, people could not overlook. And what was special was that even though that moment was not completely pure, it still did not reduce the respect he received from those who truly understood golf, because in this circle, people did not only look at what happened on the surface, but also at the way a golfer competed, the way they faced pressure, and the way they maintained themselves over time. Justin Leonard was known not for being loud, but for his professionalism. A person who always showed up with thorough preparation, with a serious attitude, and with respect for the game. His colleagues, those who had competed with him over many years, understood that clearly. They did not see him as someone who only had one big moment, but as a golfer who had maintained a high standard for a long time in an environment where even a slight decline could make you disappear. Leonard did not disappear. He existed, he adapted, and he continued, even when the world around him changed, even when the light no longer shone directly on him. And perhaps that was his true legacy, not dominance, not how long he had stood at the peak, but how he had stood firm throughout the journey. In a sport where so many talented people had come and gone, Leonard was one of those who stayed, not because he did not know when to stop, but because he understood the value of continuing, the value of perseverance, of not letting external changes alter the person inside. And when looking back, he might not be the first name mentioned when talking about the greatest golfers, but for those who truly understand golf, Justin Leonard represented something rarer, a career built not only on talent but on steadfastness, on the ability to face pressure without losing himself, and on accepting that not every great story needs to be loud. There are stories told in silence, but still deep enough to last a long time. And Leonard, in his own way, had become part of those stories. A person who did not need to dominate to be remembered, but only needed to keep walking, step by step, through the years when few truly saw everything he had to go through to hold his place in a game that was never easy. And then, after all the years that Justin Leonard had gone through, from the quiet golf courses in Dallas, the victories that took him to the peak, the non-stop pressures surrounding him, to the stages when the world gradually shifted its gaze away from him, life at 53 years old was no longer measured by trophies or leaderboards, but by a slower rhythm, a rhythm he had never had the chance to experience before. Mornings no longer began with preparation for a tense round, but with peaceful moments, with family, steps that were no longer rushed, days not divided by the dense PGA Tour schedule. And it was in that slowing down that he had time to look back at everything he had been through, not with regret, but with a deeper understanding that every stage in his life carried its own meaning, from the victory at the Open Championship in 1997 to the moment at the Ryder Cup in 1999, from the years under the pressure of expectations to the stages when he had to accept that the game had changed. All of it was no longer scattered memories, but became part of a journey he could look back on with greater calm. He no longer looked at failures as things to avoid, but as lessons that had helped him understand himself better. Understand that a sports career, no matter how glorious, was only a part of life, and that what truly remained was not the titles but the way he had lived throughout that journey. Family, which in the early years he could not always put first, now became the center of everything, not as a replacement for golf, but as a foundation that helped him maintain balance. Health, which he had once taken for granted during his competing years, was now appreciated with a different gratitude. Each day was no longer a race, but an opportunity to continue, to enjoy the things he had often missed before. And when looking back at the pressures, the setbacks, the moments when he had felt he was standing at the limit of himself, Leonard did not deny them. He did not try to erase them, but accepted them as part of who he was today, because those very things had shaped the man of today, a person who no longer needed to prove anything to the world, but still continued to walk forward, not with the goal of conquering, but with a quiet steadfastness, an understanding that the value of a person does not lie in how long they stood at the peak, but in how they had gone through the difficult stages. Justin Leonard was no longer the center of the big tournaments, no longer a name mentioned every week on the leaderboard, but he was still there, in his own world, in the life he had built, continuing to connect with golf, continuing to be present in new roles, and, most importantly, continuing to be himself. And perhaps that was something not everyone could do, because when the lights went out, when the cheers were no longer there, when attention shifted to other names, continuing to walk forward without losing the meaning of the journey was a challenge no less difficult than any tournament. Justin Leonard had overcome that challenge not with big victories, but with perseverance, with the ability to accept change, and with finding value in the things he had not had time to notice before. And in that silence, with no pressure to prove anything, no expectations to meet, there remained only a man who had been through it all, standing firm, not loud, but strong enough to continue, because sometimes the hardest thing is not winning when the whole world is watching, but continuing to walk when no one is looking anymore. And Justin Leonard, in his own way, had done that. The story of Justin Leonard leaves a feeling that is both poignant and full of respect, because it is not the journey of a person who dominated everything, but the journey of a human being who had to learn how to live with pressure, with change, and with the silence after the spotlight. From the 45-foot putt At the Ryder Cup in 1999, the moment that should have been the peak of glory, but came with controversy, to the victory at the Open Championship in 1997 that brought a major title but also carried the burden of expectation. Leonard seemed to always carry more than what a victory could give. When Tiger Woods arrived and changed the entire landscape of golf, Leonard did not disappear, but he was pushed out of the center, forced to exist in an era where the light no longer shone toward him, and it was those years of fighting in silence that made people reflect the most. What is worth cherishing does not lie in the number of titles, but in the way he continued to walk forward when victory was no longer easy, when his body was tired, when pressure no longer came from outside but from the very things he had once achieved, and then when he found balance in family, in life in Texas, when he moved into the commentator role, we see a different image. Not an athlete judged by every shot, but a human being who knew how to stop, who knew how to cherish ordinary things. For American audiences, this story is not only about golf, but about a very familiar value. Not everyone becomes the greatest, but everyone can become the most resilient in their own journey. And sometimes, in a society that always honors victory, what is more precious is the ability to continue when victory is no longer there. If the story of Justin Leonard makes you reflect on the value of perseverance and the silent battles behind glory, please hit subscribe to the channel so you do not miss journeys as real as this one. Thank you for listening until the end, and see you in the next video, where we continue to explore people who not only win, but also know how to stand firm after it all.